Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. This is part 1 of a 2-video series showing how you can build your very own home golf simulator just like this. I'll cover every aspect needed for a golf simulator, focusing on the best possible combination of quality and affordability. This first video will cover the step-by-step process for how to build a premium enclosure, which will save you over $1,400 compared to if you were to buy it online. Let's get started. Now, by far the most important part of your golf simulator is going to be your launch monitor, and I highly recommend the Mevo Plus by FlightScope. It's extremely accurate and has been shown to be within about 1 or 2% of really high-end launch monitors like TrackMan that cost over $10,000 more. Setup is extremely easy. You just turn it on with the press of one button and then set it up directly behind your hitting area, and you're ready to start playing. Having it sit behind the golf ball makes this a great option for right and left-handed golfers playing together, because you won't have to move it around. This can be used outdoors too, so if you want to bring it to the golf range, it folds up and its compact size makes it easy for transportation. But the most impressive thing to me is how well this monitor tracks back and side spin. This shot starts right off center, but it registers as a draw, which is my normal shot shape. Getting accurate ball flight data is so important to improving your game, and this is the only launch monitor at this price point which can accurately provide that data. If you're interested in the Mevo Plus and want the best possible price on it, check out my link in the video description below and use code BuildsByMaz+ at checkout. But getting back to the enclosure build, the first thing you'll need to do is clear out your space. And if you're doing it in a garage like me, you might need to do a lot of cleaning. We're going to be putting down our simulator flooring here, and you want a nice clean surface to work with. Measure out your available height and width, and I recommend going as large as possible. You'll never regret having too big of a screen, but you might regret one that's too small. In my space, I had enough room for a 9-foot by 12-foot enclosure. I'm going to be using the DIY enclosure kit from Carl's Place as my baseline comparison, because this is probably one of the most popular options among simulator users. On their website, I'm selecting the options that are most comparable to my own DIY build, and that includes a premium impact screen, a 9-foot by 12-foot enclosure, and we also need to add the pipe framing kit as well as the foam insert kit, and that brings the total to just about $2,245, so we'll use this number as our comparison price. Our enclosure frame will be built out of 1-inch EMT conduit. These come in 10-foot long tubes, and I use 12, but you may need more or less depending on your enclosure size. Don't be tempted to save money and buy the 3/4 or 1/2-inch version of these. They're going to be way too flimsy. You really need the 1-inch size, especially for a large enclosure. And a fair warning, all these pricing stickers are a huge pain to get off. To attach all the conduit tubes together, I'm going to be using these corner and edge connectors. You can buy this whole set from tarps.com, which includes everything you need specifically for a golf simulator. They fit onto the ends of the EMT tubing, and they tighten down using these included eye bolts. If you're going to paint your tubing, you need to start off by using a metal primer. This will leave you with a nicer finish because the paint will apply and adhere much better to the primer. By the way, you can find the link to every product that I use in this video down below in the video description. I used 2 cans of this Rust-Oleum satin black paint, which was enough to apply 2 coats to everything. Although painting the frame is optional, I highly recommend it. Some of these tubes are going to be visible in the finished product, and having them black helps them blend in a lot more, and it will give you a much more professional looking enclosure. After the first pass, the finish still looked a little bit spotty, and there were a few places that I missed. And that's why it's so important to give everything 2 coats, so you can get really full coverage. While that was drying, I started working on my impact screen. I got this from virtualgolfsimulator.com, and it's made of what they call their polyspacer material. This is their most high-end screen, made with a triple layer construction, and you can see how thick it is. This is comparable to the Carl's Place premium screen, and having a thick impact screen like this makes such a huge difference, especially if you have a high ball speed. It absorbs impacts really well, and I'll show a demonstration of it in use later on in the video. I bought just the raw material, which is much cheaper, but right now there's no way to attach it to the enclosure. To make my own grommets around the border, I bought this grommet tool set, which comes with everything you need to make hundreds of grommets. Each grommet has a male side, which looks like a little top hat, and a female side, which is more like a washer. This is super easy to use. You just put the male piece on the top side, the female piece goes on the bottom, and then you put the fabric in between. Now instead of having just one corner grommet, we're going to have one on either edge. That way there's not so much stress on just one piece. Line up where you want it and squeeze down with the tool, and it'll punch a hole right through the fabric. If you're using a thinner impact screen, you may want to put a layer of duct tape all around the edges before punching your grommets to give it some extra strength. But with this thick screen, I didn't feel like I needed to do that. I measured out, I think, 17 inches between each grommet going along the top side of the impact screen. I just used a little piece as a marker and then punched the hole with the tool. I then continued adding grommets all along the edge of the screen. The spacing between them may differ depending on the size of your screen, but you want to try and keep them an equal distance apart and aim for somewhere between 16 to 18 inches if possible. With the top finished, I moved to one of the edges, starting in the corner. And you want your corner to look like this, as opposed to having just one grommet there in between the two sides. I then added more grommets in the same fashion all along both the right and left edges of the screen. As a side note, be sure to do this indoors instead of in your garage so that the screen doesn't get dirty. You'll notice there are grommets along the top and both sides, but the bottom edge is left unfinished, and that's because it'll connect to the frame in a different way. Getting back to the frame, you'll have to cut down your EMT pipes to size depending on the size of your enclosure. Remember that these come in 10-foot lengths from the store. I use a reciprocating saw with a metal blade to cut mine to size, but if you don't have a tool like this, they do sell pipe cutters for pretty cheap. For my 12-foot wide enclosure, I cut down 2 of the tubes to 6 feet each and then connected them in the middle. I also used a 3-way connector in each of the back corners. When determining how deep to make your enclosure, you need to consider 2 things. 1, how close you're going to be standing to it so that you make sure your golf club never hits it. And 2, how wide the fabric is that you're going to be using for the sides. You don't want to make your enclosure any deeper than the width of the fabric. I ended up making mine just under 5 feet deep. I cut 9-foot section of tubing and placed them into the back 3-way corners to make up the height of the enclosure. At this point, I recommend at least partially tightening up some of these eye bolts. I had to add another 9-foot section of EMT into this 90-degree connector at the front of the enclosure. Since this doesn't stand upright on its own, this was definitely the most challenging piece to put into place. I held it in and connected the top with another 5-foot section. This is a great time to have someone help you out, but if you don't have anyone available, make sure you have something handy to temporarily support this front piece. I created a second 12-foot section by connecting 2 more 6-foot pieces of EMT and used that to connect the top back portion of the enclosure. With that in place, it was easier for me to add the right side connectors and then finally the top middle piece. I recommend having your flooring in place before doing the pipe framing, and the only reason I didn't was because my floor tiles were delayed in shipping, so I was waiting on them to be delivered. But once your frame is fully assembled, go ahead and fully tighten down all these eye bolts, and make sure everything is really tight. Now a pro tip for you is to buy some machine screws and use those instead of these eye bolts. I didn't think about this until I was almost done with the build, but then I went back and replaced all the eye bolts. I used this thread gauge to figure out the correct size, and these are the screws that you should buy. This will make installation a lot easier since you can use a drill, but also these small screws are a lot less noticeable. I just painted them black before installing. As far as your enclosure positioning goes, make sure you leave at least a foot of space between your wall and the back of the enclosure. That'll prevent any golf ball impacts from reaching your back wall. To attach the impact screen to the frame, we're going to use these ball bungees. You just thread it through the grommets we made, wrap it around the EMT pipe, and then attach it to itself. I installed the top edge first. Beginning in the top left corner, I attached both the top and side bungee here so it wouldn't move around as I worked my way down the top row. I then did the same thing along both sides. It's important to cut your frame about 3 inches wider than the width of your impact screen, so that you have about 1.5 inch gap on either side so there's tension on the bungees. The impact screen raw material that I bought comes with a standard height of 10 feet, and you just specify the width depending on your needs. But instead of cutting this down to size, we're just going to tuck the bottom underneath the frame and attach it to the back side. I just pulled it up taut and attached the bungee to this bottom corner grommet and looped it around the side of the frame. We'll attach it better later, but this is a good start. Another good reason to leave space behind your impact screen is so that you can access it from the back. For the sides and top of the enclosure, I use this black duck canvas. It's this woven canvas material similar to what you might see on a canvas painting. It's thin but plenty durable, and it can withstand the impact of a golf ball. This was recommended by a lot of people online, and I think it's a good option, but there is one major downside, which I'll cover in just a moment. This fabric is 5 feet wide, and you can buy it by the yard depending on how much you need to cover your full enclosure. This goes on sale at craft stores all the time, so if you wait for a fabric sale, you can save yourself some money that way. I attached the back edge of the canvas to the frame using some more grommets and bungees, and you'll see that I lined them up to be in between each of the bungees that were holding the impact screen in place. I worked my way from the bottom to the top, and then continued on the back top edge, and finally I finished down the right side. I bought these rolls of Velcro for attaching to the bottom and front of the enclosure. But here's the downside of the duck canvas. I learned that absolutely nothing sticks to it. If you used a different type of fabric for the size of your enclosure, then you can follow this method I'm using here. I put one side of the Velcro on the end of the fabric, and then wrapped it around the pipe and attach it to itself using the other side of the Velcro. And this is why you can't make your enclosure any deeper than your fabric width, because you need this overlap to wrap around the frame. I cut out a square in the bottom corner so that both the bottom and side edges could wrap around the EMT. I cut out a few 1-foot strips of the Velcro and used these to attach the front edge of the canvas. Now the actual Velcro itself is plenty strong. It's just a sticky adhesive backing which wouldn't stay put on this duck canvas. If you want to use this Velcro method, I recommend cutting out a little strip, bringing it to a craft store, and testing the adhesive side on a few different types of fabrics to see how well it sticks. I even added some duct tape along the seams to give it a little bit of extra holding power. But after just 24 hours, everything started coming loose. The Velcro adhesive does work well on other fabrics, it's just this duck canvas. I even tried this extra strength duct tape, and even that wouldn't stick to it. So I thought of a different plan, and this has worked out great for me. Instead of having the fabric wrap around this way, I had it wrap around the opposite direction. I added a grommet hole about every 18 inches all the way down this front edge. I then bought some of this black twine and used it to pull the duck canvas taut. I tied the end to the first grommet and then ran it around the frame before bringing it back through the next grommet. In this way, I just created a zigzag pattern going all the way down the side of the enclosure. After making sure everything was good and tight, I tied off the string on the bottom grommet. Here's how the outside looks once it was finished. I did the same thing on the top and right side, and from the inside view of the simulator, everything looks really crisp and clean, and you don't see any of the string lines. This has held up great, and I haven't had any more issues. The canvas did have a big crease in the middle though, from where it was folded. Using a handheld steamer, I was able to just run this up and down along the fabric, and it took out the crease lines pretty easily. I did the same thing on my impact screen, and this is a great way to get rid of all the fold lines that are going to be present from shipping. The next thing to address are these gaps along the back edges. You obviously don't want to leave it like this, because a golf ball could just slide through or hit the metal framing and ricochet back at you. I got this 2-inch thick mattress pad, which I'm going to be cutting into strips to use as the corner padding. I measured out and marked off 5-inch sections all along the length of the mattress topper. I then just cut along this line using a sharp knife. It may take 2 or 3 passes before you can cut all the way through the material. Since this foam topper is only about 6 feet long, I had to attach 2 of them together to cover each edge of the frame. I used some of this Gorilla contact adhesive to attach 2 of my pieces together. I sprayed it to both of the ends and then pressed them together. This bonds them pretty quickly, but as an added measure, I also put a layer of duct tape around the seams. I trimmed off one of the ends so that this whole piece was now the correct length, and did a test fit up against the edge of my enclosure. I bought a few yards of this black poly satin fabric, which I'm going to use to cover the foam pieces. I marked off and then cut sections of this fabric that would be wide enough to wrap completely around the foam rectangles. And I ended up with a few strips that looked like this. Just make sure you order enough fabric so that it's longer than your longest foam piece. I first folded over one end and held it in place with a little piece of duct tape. Then I folded down the corners, pulled them towards the middle, and connected it all together with a grommet. I left about a foot of space and then pulled the fabric back together and connected it with another grommet. I did the same process down the full length of the foam pad until it was fully wrapped. I trimmed off any excess fabric from the end and then closed it off in the same way that I started wrapping it at the beginning. This will attach the enclosure with zip ties. You just feed them through the grommet and then wrap them around the pipe framing and pull it tight. Starting with the top cushion, I attached both ends and then lightly connected all the rest of the zip ties. Once everything was in place, I went back and fully tightened the zip ties, which closed up all the rest of these gaps. I did the same process for both of the vertical cushions. These are easier to just feed through and then connect the zip ties from the back side. With the cushions done, I moved on to adding this black photography backdrop to the back side of the impact screen. This is going to help prevent light from coming through from behind the screen and washing out the image. I added grommets all along the top and attached them using the same bungees that were already going through the impact screen. Here you can see how significant the difference is with the backdrop installed just on the left side. And this is how it looks from the back when fully installed. It was large enough to totally cover my screen. The last thing to install are these pieces of pipe insulation, which will go around the bottom of the frame. They're hollow and easily wrap around the metal tubing. I only used 2 of these and installed them on the bottom part of the frame directly behind the impact screen. The only way this bar would ever get hit is if you hit a shot extremely thin and it doesn't get in the air at all. While these insulation wraps aren't going to provide a ton of cushioning, it's still better than having the golf ball hit the metal directly, and it should reduce the bounce back just a bit. You'll also notice that I have these bolt threads on the connector facing directly backwards, and we're going to use these eye bolts to help finish securing the bottom of the screen. I added 2 grommets to the backdrop as well as to the impact screen in the same spots. Line them up together and then thread the eye bolt through them and screw it into the frame connector. This way, both the backdrop and impact screen will be held in place, and it will keep everything looking tight after impacts from the golf balls. And that's the last step, and your premium DIY enclosure is now ready for use. I've been using this for months, and so far everything has performed great. Here's a close-up of how the impact screen handles the ball impact. It really absorbs the shot, and you don't get much bounce back. Here I'll show an example of hitting with a 60-degree wedge, and then with a driver. In both cases, the ball comes just about back to where I hit it from, which is perfect. You can adjust the bounce back as needed by adding or removing bungees from the impact screen. In total, this enclosure cost me $758 to build, which, when we compare it to the Carl's Place price of $2,245, gives us a total savings of $1,487, which I think is pretty huge. I'll be making another video which will cover everything else needed for a home golf simulator in detail, including projector requirements and setup, flooring and hitting mat options, I'll also go over computer specs, software recommendations, and I'll even show you how you can make your own canvas artwork like this. Remember, everything about your golf simulator is going to depend on having a good quality launch monitor. And if you want the best price on a Mevo Plus, check out the link below and use code BuildsByMavsPlus. I hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this home golf simulator build. And we'll see you next time.